There are places on earth where the very first time you hear their name, a quiet sense of unease rises up in you. Not because of war, and not because of natural disasters, but because of a question that sends a chill down your spine. Why are there lands people are warned not to enter, even though they still stand right here in the middle of our world? If history is only what is already over, why do some locations still carry fear as if the punishment never truly ended? And if time can erase everything, why are there places where the silence feels heavier than any scream? Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. This is not where we repeat history the way you were taught. This is where we track forgotten sacred traces, warnings that were dismissed, and truths that make modern people uncomfortable to face. And right now, we begin with a land whose mere existence raises a terrifying question. What happened here that even the prophets did not want people to treat it like an ordinary destination? People today have a dangerous habit, turning everything into an experience. Mountains become backdrops, ancient graveyards become photo stops, and places tied to the pain of an entire people get labeled as heritage sites. But there are lands that refuse to be turned into scenery. They do not tell their story through informational signs or guided tours. They tell it through a creeping discomfort that slips into the mind of anyone who has only just heard the name. Alula is one of those places. Not because it is empty, but because that emptiness carries the memory of something that was cut off from the normal flow of history. From far away, Alula can make people stare in awe. Red rock towers rise out of the desert, deep valleys look like they were carved by time itself, and ancient structures still hold the marks of human hands from thousands of years ago. But the longer you look, the more you feel that something is off. It does not have the peaceful feeling of ruins that have finally gone to sleep. Instead, there is a thick, heavy silence, as if the place is holding its breath, guarding the trace of an event that was never truly forgotten. People who pass through often do not say much. Not because there is nothing to say, but because they do not know what to say in front of a place that seems like it does not want to be explained. What makes this land different is not the rock, and it is not the architecture. It is the fact that this place was mentioned in sacred warnings. In Islamic history, there are locations that are not spoken of with curiosity but with caution. Not because they are dangerous in the way people usually mean, but because they are the remains of a lesson that was too big. A lesson about what happens when human beings reach the peak of power and then start believing they no longer owe accountability to anyone. And on a land like that, centuries after a civilization was erased, the messenger of Allah passed through. Not to admire it, not to explore it, just to cross it during a journey marked by hardship. What happened after that made this place more than a name on a map. It became a living reminder of the line between curiosity and disrespect, between understanding and taking things lightly. Before we go deeper into that story, pause for a moment and ask yourself, if there were a place where history, faith, and fear all meet, would you approach it like a tourist or like someone standing in front of a warning? Because sometimes the most dangerous thing is not stepping into a cursed land, but stepping into it with a mindset that no longer knows what it means to fear. If you feel that this is not just a story to hear and forget, but a journey that deserves to be considered all the way to the end, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained right now. Your support is what drives us to keep uncovering stories buried in history, warnings that still matter, and truths that not everyone is ready to face. The journey that history would later call the expedition of Tabuk did not begin with triumph. It began with exhaustion. It was movement under conditions where every step drained what little strength was left. Every breath carried the heat of the desert, and every drop of water became a thin line between staying alive and collapsing. The people traveling with the Prophet Muhammad were not experienced seekers, and they were not explorers looking for new lands. They were walking out of duty, out of faith, and out of the command to keep moving forward, even though the road promised nothing but hardship. Many nights they traveled in the dark to avoid the scorching daytime heat. When they stopped, they slept under an empty sky with no shelter and no guarantee that there would be enough water to continue the next day. In moments like that, people do not think about history or ancient stories. They think about survival. That is why, when that valley appeared before them along with wells sitting silently between rock and sand, it did not look like a warning. It looked like mercy arriving right on time. Some of them drew water as soon as they could. Others drank quickly as if the source might disappear if they hesitated. Some even used that water to mix flour, preparing bread for the road ahead. In that moment, nobody thought they were doing anything wrong. There was no sign that this land was different, no marker carved with a warning. Everything looked like any other stopping point in the vast desert. And that is when the command was given. Not in anger, not with shouting, but in a voice that seemed to make the air grow heavy. The Prophet Muhammad told them to stop. Do not drink the water here. Do not use this water to knead dough. And anything that had already been prepared with this water had to be thrown out immediately. Hands holding water skins froze. People preparing bread were stunned. Nobody understood why, but nobody hesitated. What frightened the companions was not only the order, but what they saw on the face of the messenger of Allah. This was not the familiar strictness of a leader enforcing discipline. It was a deep sadness mixed with a kind of worry, as if he was seeing something the others could not see. He walked slowly toward the wells, his eyes fixed on the rocks around them, as if the land itself was whispering to him about an unseen memory. Then he gave an instruction that was not long, but it was enough to carve itself into the mind of everyone there. If you must pass through this land, pass through it while you are weeping. If you cannot weep, then pass through it with fear in your heart. This was not symbolic language, and it was not dramatic exaggeration. It was a direct instruction tied to a serious truth that did not need more explanation. In that moment, the group understood they were not standing in an ordinary place. Not because life was missing there, but because this land had witnessed something that changed the relationship between human beings and the blessings of Allah. The silence in the valley suddenly became heavier. It was no longer the quiet of nature. It was the quiet of a warning waiting to be heard. The companions hurried to pour the water out onto the ground. The dough that had already been kneaded was gathered and given to animals. Nobody felt regret. In a place where the messenger of Allah showed fear like this, nobody wanted to keep even a small part of what had been forbidden. The army continued forward with heads lowered, moving in an unusual silence. There were no whispered stories, no complaints about hunger or thirst. Only a shared feeling that they were crossing the edge of a lesson larger than themselves. That event is not remembered as a minor detail in the journey to Tabuk. It stands as a marker, showing that there are places where even human necessity cannot cross a sacred boundary. And it raises an uncomfortable question for anyone hearing this story today. If, in the most intense hunger and thirst, people were still required to give up what looked like a gift, then where is the real boundary of obedience? Because the most frightening thing in that moment was not the lack of water. It was the realization that some lands carry the consequences of what happened there long ago. And when the Prophet Muhammad told them to pass through in tears or in fear, he was not only speaking to his companions, he was sending a message across time. Some lessons are not carved into the world with words, but with destruction, and the respect you show those lessons is a measure of faith. Before this land became a symbol of caution and fear, Before these warnings were passed down through generations, it was once the center of a civilization that many other peoples admired. Thamud did not rise out of poverty, and they did not grow up in weakness. They entered history with strength, skill, and the confidence of those who believed they had reached the peak of what human beings could do. In a brutal desert, they did not merely survive. They built. They turned mountains into homes, valleys into cities, and they left traces that still amaze people thousands of years later. What matters is that their collapse did not begin with a war, and it did not begin with a natural disaster. It began quietly with a shift in how they saw themselves. As wealth increased, as their structures grew higher, and as their techniques became more refined, a dangerous idea formed in their minds, that what they had was the result of their own hands and their own intelligence. Blessings started to feel normal. Gratitude was replaced by a sense of ownership. And from there, the distance between people and the one who grants all things began to widen. At first, Thamud still mentioned Allah, but over time, the very rocks that were once signs of blessing became objects of worship. They bowed to what they themselves had made, forgetting that their ability to build was not something they created on their own. Prosperity, instead of making them humble, fed their arrogance. And when people believe they no longer owe accountability to any higher power, corruption no longer feels foreign. In that setting, the prophet Salih was sent among them. He did not come as a stranger. He was from their own community. His call was not new, and it was not complicated. It was a reminder to return to the oneness of Allah and to remember that what they held was not the independent achievement of human beings. But to a people who had grown used to seeing success as proof of their own superiority, that reminder felt offensive. It touched the one thing they did not want to admit, that their strength had limits. They did not reject him immediately. Instead, they demanded a sign, a miracle big enough to force belief, as if faith should only be given when people feel they are still in control. That was the moment their mindset flipped, from being the ones reminded to becoming the ones who set conditions. The miracle they demanded was not simple, and when it happened, nobody could deny it. But here a crucial truth became clear. A miracle is never a reward for skepticism. It is a test of obedience. The civilization of Thamud, for all its glory, did not fall because it lacked knowledge or resources. It fell because they no longer knew how to place limits on themselves. When power does not come with responsibility, when wealth does not walk alongside gratitude, every achievement becomes fragile. The stone walls they believed were unbreakable could not protect them from the corruption growing inside. What makes this story haunting is not that a people were destroyed, but that the road to destruction is terrifyingly familiar. It did not begin with a huge crime, but with small self-satisfaction. It did not begin with open rebellion, but with slowly forgetting the source of blessing. And when the reminder came, they did not reject it because they did not understand. They rejected it because they did not want to give up the sense of control they had grown comfortable with. Looking back at Thamud, it is easy to criticize them from the distance of time. But that distance is exactly what makes the story dangerous, because it creates the illusion that this was only a mistake from the past. In reality, it is a pattern. A model that repeats whenever people reach the peak of power and begin to believe they have moved beyond all sacred limits. Thamud did not vanish because they did not know how to build. They vanished because they forgot why they were allowed to build. And that forgetting turned cities carved into stone into living proof that strength, when separated from faith and humility, does not lead to permanence. It leads to an ending carved deep into history. A miracle never appears to satisfy people. It appears to reveal who people are when they no longer have excuses. For Thamud, the she-camel was not a reward for belief. It was the final boundary between obedience and betrayal. When they made their demand, they thought they held the advantage, that if the miracle did not come, they would have a reason to refuse. But when the rock split and that living sign appeared before them, every argument collapsed. There was no room left for doubt, no space left for ambiguity. Only one clear choice remained: accept the discipline Allah set, or expose their true nature. The rule that was given was not complicated. It did not require a huge sacrifice, and it did not demand that they give up wealth or power. It was simply sharing the water supply by day, a basic rhythm of fairness. One day belonged to the she-camel and one day belonged to the people. It was the smallest test for a nation that took pride in strength and control. And because it was so small, it became unbearable. It did not strike directly at their property or their reputation. It struck something deeper, the feeling that there was a boundary they were not allowed to cross. At first, the discomfort was only whispers. Why should we share what belongs to us? Why should a sign have equal rights with us? Those questions were not shouted, but they spread fast like sand that pulls you down. Day after day, resentment grew. Not because there was no water, but because pride had been wounded. When people are used to giving orders, being required to follow, even under a fair rule, starts to feel like humiliation. A plot formed in the dark, not by the whole community, but by a small group. 9 men gathered at night carrying a decision they believed would free their people from what they called disgrace. They did not kill an animal because they were starving. They killed a sign because it challenged them. And in that moment, they did not only attack an innocent creature, they attacked the very boundary Allah had placed over them. When the news reached the Prophet Salih, he did not explode in anger. His silence was heavier than any scolding. Then the warning came, not as a threat, but as a statement of what could not be avoided. 3 days, not to run and not to repair the damage, but to realize what was coming. On the first day, faces turned yellow. On the second day, they burned red. On the third day, they turned black like darkness. Each day was a clear sign that their time was running out. The most frightening part was not the signs themselves, but the human response to them. They saw, they understood, and they still did not change. The truth was too clear to deny, but pride made them stand still. When the Prophet Salih left the city with those who believed, the dawn of the 4th day rose under a tension so thick it felt like it could choke you. There were no more warnings, no more chances, only the execution of what had already been foretold. The sound that came down was unlike anything people had ever heard. It did not only destroy houses, it tore apart the sense of safety Thamud had built in their own minds. The ground shook, and the mountains they thought were permanent became the tool that buried them. Hands once proud of carving stone could not hold on to life. In a brief moment, every achievement collapsed. No palace, no tomb, no skill could protect them from the consequence of a choice they had already made. This story does not exist to describe the cruelty of punishment. It exists to expose a law. When the sign of Allah is treated like an obstacle, when discipline is treated like an insult, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes the outcome. In this case, the miracle did not save anyone. It only revealed who was willing to bow and who chose to stand tall until there was nothing left to stand on. The lesson of Thamud is not in their destruction, but in the moment before it, when everything could still have gone differently. They saw, they were warned, and they were given time to reflect. But they chose to hold on to control instead of humility. And that choice turned a miracle into a sentence, a sign into a verdict, and a glorious civilization into an eternal reminder that not every test is given so people can win, but so people can learn when to stop. There is a paradox that makes it hard for anyone who understands the sacred history of this land to stay calm. A place once spoken of with caution, a place the prophets passed through with fear in their hearts, is now lit up by stage lights, filled with music, cheering, and festivals that last deep into the night. Not because people no longer remember the story of Thamud, but because they have learned to place that story in the past as something closed and no longer connected to the present. That shift did not happen overnight. It began with ideas that sound harmless: development, tourism, economic revival. Rocks that once carried the meaning of a lesson were covered by the language of progress. Valleys that once carried heavy silence were redefined as event spaces. Little by little, sacred memory was replaced by experience, and caution gave way to curiosity that was encouraged. People entered a land once treated as a warning, not with fear, but with cameras in their hands and entertainment on their minds. The problem is not that people build or organize events. The problem is that they do it without asking questions anymore. When a place once mentioned as the trace of divine punishment is turned into a stage, the most troubling thing is not that music plays. It is the silence of the conscience. That silence says what happened here was just an old tale, and that modern people have advanced so far they no longer need to listen to outdated warnings. But the history of destroyed nations is never told only to be remembered. It is told to awaken people. When the Prophet Muhammad instructed his companions to pass through this land in tears or with fear in their hearts, that was not a personal emotional reaction. It was a deep awareness of the link between sacred memory and the present moment. A place that once witnessed the consequences of arrogance does not become harmless just because time has passed. Great lessons do not lose their value simply because later generations choose not to look at them directly. Even more frightening is how modern people often comfort themselves. They say punishment belonged to another era, that those stories no longer apply to a world that has changed. But the way of Allah has never changed. What changes is the human attitude toward limits. When entertainment is placed above reverence, when memory is treated like a burden instead of a warning, repetition is no longer surprising. It is only a matter of time and a matter of form. The contrast between the past and the present of this land forces a question that is hard to escape. Did people truly learn anything from what happened? Or did they only learn how to tell the story in a way that makes them feel safe? Because if the lesson of Thamud is treated as a tragedy that is finished, then repeating their spirit in a new form becomes completely possible. You do not need to kill a sacred sign. Turning it into a backdrop, turning it into decoration, is enough to drain it of its meaning. The most important part of this story is not judging modern decisions. It is each person looking inward, because forgetting does not begin with huge projects or bright festivals. It begins the moment people stop feeling uneasy about warnings. When fear is called outdated and reverence is treated like an obstacle, the distance between people and sacred lessons becomes more dangerous than ever. In that sense, alula is not only a location, it is a mirror reflecting how people treat memory when memory is no longer convenient. It reminds us that some places were not meant to entertain people but to keep them awake. And when places like that become stages, the question is no longer whether it is right or wrong. The question is whether people are ready to carry the consequences of forgetting. In the end, the biggest message is not found only in the fall of Thamud, and it is not found only in modern lights shining on ancient stone. It is found in the choice every generation must face. Either listen to warnings carved deep by history or keep walking with the belief that they will be the exception. And it is that choice, not any festival or construction project, that decides whether a land carrying sacred memory will remain a reminder or become a sign of another repetition still to come. From there, the deepest lesson is not only for a distant era, but for every individual alive today. When life is comfortable, when success and convenience keep increasing, the question is not how much we have achieved. The question is whether we still remember who gave us the ability to achieve it. And when we stand in front of warnings about morality, faith, and limits, do we listen with reverence, or do we brush them aside as outdated? In real life, that begins with very small choices. Holding on to gratitude and success, holding on to humility and authority, whether that authority is in your family, your workplace, or your community. Not turning sacred values into decoration and not treating faith as an accessory to life. And more than anything, learning how to stop when you need to stop, even when that goes against personal desire or immediate convenience. If you feel that stories like these are not only for listening but for holding up a mirror to yourself, join the Prophetic History Explained community. There we explore more sacred historical stories, forgotten lessons, and signs that still matter for modern people. And if you want to support the channel so it can keep bringing you content with this kind of depth, subscribe today. Your support does not only help the channel grow, it helps keep the warnings of history from sinking into silence.